Right. And we are going live. We're waiting for Facebook to load up, but it's good to see you all today. How you all doing, social workers of Alabama, and the rest of you all who are joining today? I like to take this opportunity each week to talk with you a little bit about what we discuss in our supervision groups. I have several groups and we talk about so much. It's just hard to cover, but I try to summarize it because if some of you are interested and learning more about how to present as supervisors and just about practice, we try to take this opportunity. But I want to go on and get into what we have to talk about today and the subject for today, what we've been discussing throughout the week, because it's been a week where, this is the season. This is the season for what we talk about. There's a lot of depression and things going around in this season. And so some of the clinicians, some of us are experiencing that we're working with individuals who are experiencing depression, and then also the seasonal depression, but also the loss of loved ones is a factor here. Many, and a lot of times when I'm talking to my clients, it's not even them directly. It could be their spouse that lost someone, and then they start feeling a certain way as a result of that. And so we're talking today a little bit on the subject of um, of grief and depression and prolonged grief disorder. And what's the difference with that and depression? Is there a difference between prolonged grief disorder and depression? And so we're going to look into that today. All right. And so let's just go on and jump in. Let's go on and jump in. And so some of the things that we talked about, it's interesting because I had one of my supervisees to share an experience that she was having, and she had an experience with a loved one who actually lost um a like a let's just say a nephew, okay? And it was like a grandnephew, okay? But then they were experiencing significant grief as a result of this. And the supervisor described it as if it was something when they would talk about the loss, it would be as if it was brand new, you know. And the way that the young child was only about a year old, and they were lost due to some neglect of the parents, like significant neglect to that brought about the demise of the child, and they deceased. And so with that relative, it was mentioned like, man, this has been 4 years since this has happened. Um, it's been a number of years, and is this, is this is this is this would this be depression? Is this prolonged grief disorder? And so we talked a little bit about that in our session, and we talked in some of the other sessions about what does it look like when someone just seems as though they're stuck, and they feel stuck and they cannot get over the loss of a loved one. I know where I live, it's a sad thing, but it's a young lady that when I drive by, she's usually near the railroad track, and you see the the things that they set up when someone has died. And I pass by and often see her probably on a weekly basis, and she's sitting there. Maybe it looks like some coffee or something like that, and it's just there. And she's been doing this a long time. Um, I thought about it one time and I said, if that was my client, would we talk about how important it is to somewhat maybe distance that a little bit. Not distance it from the standpoint of distance yourself from the situation, but maybe we don't go and visit as much to the site. And have that time like that each week, because then it's difficult to move on. But then I thought about it. And I said, I don't think that that would be something that I would advise that client. For one thing, I'll try to find out where they are with things. Um, but it made me think about that, the fact is, and something that we have to keep in mind is that everybody grieves differently. You know, for some people, it takes them going out to the site daily, weekly, monthly, re-experiencing it in a sense. You know, I don't believe that sometimes that's the healthiest way. But we as clinicians are not to place judgment on how someone grieves, especially when that's not your loved one that was lost. So, how would you work with a client that you saw or that you knew was experiencing something like this to where, let's just say it's been 2 years and they cannot, they have to, if they don't visit the site, they feel guilt, they feel shame, they feel separation, they re-experience the grief. Would this be a person that would be experiencing depression? If they're sad, they're often sad, right? They're often sad. They lose sleep, right? Okay. So would this be a person who is his experience is experiencing depression, or would it be something like a prolonged grief situation? Do we even know what prolonged grief disorder is? Because guess what? From my understanding, it's new. It's pretty new, and it's something that came through with the new DSM-TR back in 2022. So, what is prolonged grief disorder? What is the separation? Well, when I talk with my supervisees, we always talk about how to identify the symptoms of depression. And so, when we look at the symptoms of depression, what we what I like to help them so they could keep it top of mind. Some of them are way smarter than me, so they don't need something like this. But how I keep it at the top of mind so that I recognize the symptoms, y'all have heard me talk about it probably before, is the mnemonic SIGI CAPS. Now, what is SIGI CAPS? It's the spelling of it's the spelling, it gives you the mnemonic for the symptoms of depression. And so we have to evaluate with SIGI CAPS, SIGE, sleep, uh, interest, guilt, energy. Okay. Uh, we at the E, we're at the E. C is concentration. A is appetite. P is psychomotor agitation. And S is suicidality. So are these some of the things that we're seeing in this situation? Okay. Um, just because someone has sadness, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have depression. So these are some of the things that we have to look into, and this is what we talked about. What I do want to do is identify what the symptoms are of prolonged grief disorder. So I'd ask them like, what's the intensity and duration when we don't know the difference between a diagnosis of something? It's important to look at what is the frequency, intensity, and duration of the symptoms that we're talking about. And so, in order to understand the diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, we talked about how what is prolonged? What is prolonged? What does prolonged mean? Like how long is prolonged? And so in a situation with prolonged grief disorder, your client would have had to been experiencing this for at least a year or 12 months. Okay. At least a 12-month period. And then by the time they came in to talk to you, they would have needed to experience the symptoms within 30 days, almost every day of the week. Okay. And so the central focus of these symptoms that they are having, the sadness, some of the identity disruption, because they can't separate themselves from that individual that's been lost. They can't seem to function without thinking about this individual. So they're experiencing marked emotional pain, difficulty moving forward, not as if anybody can move forward from the loss of someone, but you just can't move forward in your relationships. It's impacting sometimes their social, occupational, and personal concerns, maybe. And so these are the things that we will look into. So that right there that I mentioned, these are the marked symptoms. These are the things that help us identify that, their depression, not that someone can't have depression that has been linked to the loss of a loved one, but when we're talking about prolonged grief disorder, we're talking about at least a year or more of someone being in a state. And I mentioned some of the symptoms that are involved with that particular condition. Now, there was a few other questions that we asked because we were on the subject of grief, and it's hard to talk about grief without talking about the stages of grief. It's hard to talk about prolonged grief disorder without talking about the stages of grief. And the stages of grief, I asked the question I want to ask you, who was the architect of the stages of grief, which we know are relevant to if you lost someone to death, but it's relevant to some other things as well. And that was a challenging question, a question I challenged them with. And the answer for that is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She is the architect of that. And I remember this one from college. And so one way I remember the symptoms, what are the symptoms? That's the next question. What are the symptoms of grief? Because if we're making these diagnoses and things like that, if we're trying to identify if how deep the person's grief is or what stage of grief that they're in, then it's important to know these theories and put them into practice. And so the stages of grief, see, I'm going back to some of y'all, when we were in school, are what? Denial. And how I remember that is the word dabda. Again, I'm a mnemonics guy or I know nothing. I'm just like, you would think that I was incompetent. But dabda, D-A-B, I can't spell that, D-A. D-A-B-D-A. So that's dabda. So we've got denial, anger, bargaining, okay? Depression, uh, yeah, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. So there's 5 stages. They may have made a variation of that. I think it's still there. And so acceptance, of course, is when we get down to the end and we have been able to cope and navigate through these circumstances and situations. One thing I wanted to point out that I wasn't able to find a lot of research about, but I'm sure it's out there if this what I'm about to say makes any sense. But what I have noticed is, well, let's start with this question now I wanted to ask is I want to ask you this, what are maybe predictors that someone might experience prolonged grief disorder? Let me wrap this up. What are some predictors that someone might experience prolonged grief disorder? Well, there are a few things, right, that we need to know, and this helps us with our treatment. So predictors, I couldn't necessarily find a firm predictor, but one of the things that I did find is that it is more common in a prolonged grief disorder for someone that this would occur if someone lost someone that they were in a close relationship with, a loss of any close relationship, but it's more common with someone who has had a death of a spouse or romantic partner, or when a parent loses a child, God forbid, right? Okay. But then there's something else that might, I don't want to say it's a predictor, but in some way it may be like what kind of tells us that this is more probable that prolonged grief disorder could occur. I couldn't find the things that I really wanted. But one thing is that the risk of prolonged grief disorder increases when there is death that is unexpected, sudden, or violent. So the risk of PGD increases when the death is unexpected, sudden, or violent. And in the situation that I was talking about earlier, that is exactly what occurred. It was a somewhat of a violent death, or it was definitely unexpected. Okay. And so, yeah, these are the things that catch us off guard. And sometimes the mind just has a difficult time, wrapping around that. Now, one of the things that when I working with clients that have these symptoms, I always want to rule out, again, I haven't found in the research, is sometimes there's an element of guilt. I'm not saying that that's always there, but guilt from the standpoint of the bargaining perspective, if we're looking at Kubler-Ross. And what is bargaining? So bargaining is often when we start asking those questions like, well, would this have happened if I had done this, or if I had done that, or if I had been there for the person, or if I had just listened the last time that they told me that they were hurting. So we have this thing that happens many times where there's this feeling of guilt as if there was something that the client could have done to avoid or change the outcome that they have experienced with the loss. This is something, in my opinion, that we want to rule out. It may be a low percentage chance that this is going on, but it's certainly something that we want to rule out because that's something that can be I'm not saying easily processed, but once we do techniques like CBT and things like that, then we can get a different perspective. And then the person can start grieving differently. It's different when you're grieving because you feel a part of the reason why that person is there versus them just being deceased. And that's the thing that we want to make sure that our clients are not attached to. Man, I get so caught up in this that I don't remember to let you all know kind of what we have going on. And so I do want to let you know that, hey, we have a new training. It's super interesting. The topic is assessing autism and ADHD in women, a gender and diversity informed approach. Look, this is going to be a fire training. It's going to be presented by none other than we have two presenters. Let me see if I can bring this up real quick. Um, and this is for the required DSM-5 training for those of us who are clinically licensed and are needing the DSM required DSM training. We want you to come to ours if you can. And so we will have Dr. Jennifer Ritchie, and she's going to be presenting on the topic that I just mentioned. And then we're so excited to have Amanda as well, and she's going to be presenting on the topic of DMDD, weathering the storm, assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And of course, these topics are going to be comprehensive. We'll be covering a whole lot, but we do have to title them. And so if you're interested, come check it out. And then we still have our other training that is on demand. And this is the DSM training that you can get this one on demand, take it at any time. If you have any questions, hit me in the chat. But I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you've been having a blessed and happy holiday thus far. One other thing, look, we are planning, hopefully, it's been a lot of people that are interested in learning more about travel social work. I'm trying to put something together. I'm hoping it goes through. If it does, it will be within the next week or two. And we want to make it a CEU too. So we'll keep you posted on that. But y'all take care and thanks for being a part of Social Workers of Alabama. And if you're not yet, thanks for joining.